again, and thank you for joining us by way of the internet. Social media has provided us an opportunity to be able to come to you since you cannot come to the church. Thank you for joining us for our church school, church in training, church at study. We believe in preparing ourselves so that we can be workmen that are not ashamed, being able to rightly divide the word of truth. We're going through a series of lessons that's found in the Message book that it's printed by our Sunday School Publishing Board, which is an affiliate of our National Baptist Convention. Thank you, Dr. Talbert, and for those who work to make this possible for us. Join along with us as we go through the lesson tonight, Justice Prevail. Reverend Darrell Fielder will be leading us in tonight's lesson. Miss you. Can't wait to see you again.
Good evening. Thank you again for joining us for another evening of our church in training, or church school, as we're calling it now, by way of social media. We're glad that you have been joining us, and we hope that you've enjoyed the lessons thus far. We hope that you have a book so that you can follow along. If not, contact the church and we'll try to do our best to get that book to you. And if you're familiar with it, or if you've been keeping up with the lessons, we've been discussing justice the last few weeks. Justice has been the focus of most of our lessons, and tonight is no different. We're also looking at justice again with a lesson entitled Justice Prevails. And tonight we're coming from a book of the Bible that may not be too familiar to many of us, because we don't see many lessons or hear many sermons preached from this particular book of the Bible. And that book of the Bible is the book of Esther. Tonight we are in Esther chapter 7. That's where we find our lesson for tonight. And I'd like to, kind of suggest that there's a reason why many of us aren't too familiar with this book, this particular book of the Bible, because this is the only book in the Bible where the name of God or prayer isn't found in the book. If you search through the chapters of this book, the verses, you'll find that the name of God or even prayer isn't found in the book. And sadly, many of us need to physically see and read God to catch what God is saying or doing. A lot of us can't really read between the lines to see God at work. We have to physically see what God is doing, which leads us most times to not trust that God is working on our behalf. But this book shows us that even though we can't find him in the words of the book, we see him working throughout the book. Even though we can't see him mentioned, we can see that God is indeed moving throughout this book. And this is also true for many of us as it relates to the topic of justice. We want to see justice. Social justice is one of the top priorities of the day. But a lot of times we don't see God in justice. In fact, we don't even think that God cares about justice because we don't see it in the Bible, or we don't read about it. And that's because we don't really pay attention. In fact, the truth of the matter is salvation was about justice. If you really think about what salvation is, saving us was a form of justice. Jesus came to break up the unjust ways of the powers that be and to restore our relationship with God so that God would deal with us justly. So we should celebrate that we are justified, but we shouldn't stop at just shouting about our newfound position in God. And that's where I'd like to kind of hang my hat with this lesson tonight, because we find in the book of Esther that Esther has made her way to the position of queen, and she's a high-ranking position. And even in her high-ranking position, she had a burden for her people. Esther was a Jew. The king was unaware. The king's administration was unaware that she was a Jew, but there had been a decree that the king had signed that basically said that all Jews were to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. And when she heard about this decree, Esther had a burden on her heart. In spite of her position, she had the burden for her people. In fact, in Esther chapter 7, verse 4, it says that she received word that the Jews are to be sold, or were sold rather, to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. And the book tells us that when she hears this, Esther decides to step out on faith. That's the first point in our book tonight, is stepping out on faith. She makes a plea for justice. And what does this plea look like? How does it look to step out on faith in regards to justice or social justice? She was willing to speak up for her people, even if it meant frustrating the people that had put her in the position she was in. You know, she was the queen. She had an intimate relationship with the king, so no way the king was going to allow anybody to kill her. But when she heard that her people could possibly be killed or destroyed, she had a burden on her for those people. Even with her position, she decides to set up this meeting with the king so that she could get the king's ear and save her people. I wonder, you know, looking at this, how many of us with our positions, our high-ranking jobs, our financial positions would be willing to risk all of that to save our people? And by our people, it could be Christian, it could be black, it could be women, it could be men, or whatever you want to say your people are. Could you risk giving up all that you have attained throughout your life, your fame and fortune? Are you willing to risk all of that to save your people? That's really what faith looks like. Faith isn't about believing God to do something material. Although we thank God for all that he has given us, a lot of times we don't equate faith to speaking up on the behalf of others or seeking justice on the behalf of others, because they didn't know she was a Jew. And if she came out about these Jewish people and then they found out she was a Jew, although she didn't feel the king would kill her, it's a possibility that she could die for speaking up for her people. How often, or how many of us rather, are willing to put our trust in God so much that we're willing to risk all that we've gained, all the wealth that we've attained, our positions on our jobs, our homes, and whatever else we hold near and dear to our heart, to speak up for other people? Are you willing to stand for justice in today's times? I know, you know, Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement and all these things that we see on the news and the media. Is anybody willing to speak up for those people who are at risk of losing their lives, not because they did anything wrong or they've committed any crimes, or just because somebody wants to see them dead? Are you willing to make a step of faith and plead for justice? But watch what happens when she does this. When she decides to set up this banquet and ask the king or petition the king to save the people, in verse 5, she addresses what the issue was. She reveals who she was, and the king asked her who was responsible for setting up her people for certain death. And Esther doesn't hesitate to call out the one responsible. She calls out Haman. In doing this, she exposes the injustice. Not only does she make a plea for justice, when given the opportunity, she speaks to directly what the issue was. She exposes Haman for being the one who set up this decree, who not only planned to have Esther and her people killed, but if you do further examination of the text, he had planned to have Mordecai killed, who had saved the king's life previously, and knowing that the king wouldn't allow his queen to be killed, after she calls him out, after she, you know, makes her plea and exposes injustice, the king is so furious that he gets up and he leaves. The king leaves from where they are, and Esther is left in the room with the very one that set up her people. And watch what happens. Something very great happens here. The person that has set up her people for death is now begging her for his own life. Did you catch it? The very person that set them up for death is now pleading with her for his own life. And that's a lot of times how God works in our lives. You know, we are too afraid sometimes to call out the enemy, to call out what exactly it is that's bothering us. But Esther teaches us in this narrative that when you take a step of faith and boldly call out the enemy for what they are doing, God will in turn flip the script and have the enemy begging you to spare their life. You know, you don't have to take my word for it. A very familiar scripture comes to mind, the story of Joseph, where Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery, and all these bad things happen to Joseph. And given the chance to see them again, Joseph says, what you meant for evil, God indeed turns it around for our good. And that's not just with Joseph. That's not just with Esther. You too can testify of times in your life where the enemy did things or tried to do things to you. And when you boldly called out or exposed the enemy for what they were doing, God somehow found a way to flip the script. Perhaps you don't like Joseph's story. Perhaps you're more familiar with what Paul tells us in Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for our good. All things mean all things. That means the good and the bad somehow works out for our good. So Esther in this narrative, she steps out on faith. She makes a plea to the king for justice. In doing so, the king asks her, who is the one responsible for this injustice? Esther doesn't hesitate to call out the very one who was also in the room, who served on the king's administration, calls him out and says he's the one that is doing this. And watch what happens. When faith meets courage, justice always triumphs. I'm going to say it again. When faith meets courage, justice always triumphs. She builds up, she steps out on faith. She makes a plea for justice. She's exposed the injustice. And watch what happens. Watch the series of events. I told you that the king had left out because he was so furious that someone in his cabinet had set up this decree and this order to kill his wife's people. So when he comes back, before he could even get out of his mouth what he wanted to be done, his servants decided that they would use the same large spear that Haman had prepared to kill Mordecai to kill him in front of the entire city. I'm going to say it one more time. Haman had put together this very large spear, this very large knife or sword, if you will, that he was going to personally use to kill Mordecai. And that very same utensil that he was going to use to kill Mordecai, the king allows his servants to kill him that way. You missed it again. God allowed what the enemy had set up to kill his people to be the very tool used to kill them. So the plot and the plan that they had put in place to kill God's people, God somehow got in it, flipped the script, and allowed what was meant to harm and kill them to kill and harm them. You know, I used to hear my grandmother and them say this phrase about if you dig a ditch, you might as well dig two, because the ditch you're digging for me might as well be for you. I didn't know as a little boy that that's in the Bible. Did y'all know that? That in Proverbs, it speaks of when you dig a ditch for someone else, you might as well dig one for yourself. Because the same traps, the same plot that you put in place for them, God has a way to flip the script, turn things around so that they become the victim of their own plots and their own plans. Victory is something that requires opposition. You don't have victory over anything. You have to have an oppressor, an opponent, an opposition to be victorious over. And a lot of times we want to live this squeaky clean Christianity where we don't have any opponents, any enemies, anybody against us. But that's not true. The Bible speaks of we have this enemy, this adversary daily that is against us, and his name is Satan. But God has a way of turning Satan's plots, Satan's plans into ways that Satan will see his own demise. In fact, if you're saved, you realize that you're not fighting for victory. You're fighting from a place of victory. We already have the victory, but sometimes it takes us speaking up and acting out in order for us to see that victory in our lives. And Esther teaches us that she allowed her faith in God, her courage in the God that she served, to do something to seek justice for her people. And in doing so, she not only saved herself, but she saved all of the people. And that's a word for us that I think we ought to hang on to in this day and time. A lot of times what we're doing is not for us. The things that we say, the things that we do may not be for us. They may not benefit us at all. They may not add or take away from anything in our lives. But if you find yourself speaking up on the behalf of others, aren't you glad that God can save someone else through your prayers? Aren't you glad someone can be saved through your actions? Not just saved, but a mouth can be fed. They can receive shelter just by your act of faith and stepping out and speaking up against those injustices, because we know that as Christians, in the end, we always win. So why fear? Why doubt? Why not trust God to do what God said that he's going to do in our lives? Remember that in everything that we go through, we already have the victory.
Remember tonight's prayer conference call at 7:15. Just as a reminder, mute your phones once you get in. Can't wait to join you in prayer.